Hello, mate, to Thrive Nation. It's all about bone health, muscle health, and nutrition, and what you need to get into your diet and your eating plans. I've got Dr. Sandra Iuliano, who's a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne. Welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time. And real, your calling's amazing, and the amount of papers you've published has been incredible. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Let's get right into it now with regards to nutrition and what's happening to bone health. Let's focus on bone health because I've just seen a plethora of chronic disease now being 25 years in practice. Obesity rates are up, chronic disease is up. 50% of all American children have a chronic disease, 50%. So there's been a plethora of diseases. What's happening to the status of bone health with regards to the youth and our seniors?
Yeah, look, two parts to it. One, from the data, we know that children aren't getting enough calcium. Generally, in developed countries, children get enough protein, but we find they're not getting enough calcium. And so it's during growth that we lay the bone down. The other part of that is exercise. So they're not exercising as much. So impact type exercise. So children normally, run around the playground, hop, jump, skip. Those types of exercises are perfect for bone because what it does is it lays bone down to accommodate the impact. With children and adolescents, once you lay the bone down, it's there for good.
Okay, good. So you reach your maximum bone density in your youth, and obviously, it was really good to have your colleague on the show, and we've released her episode, which I think was, really important, Dr. Becky. But tell us about that at sort of the youth and the young adolescent age, why it's so important to get calcium. I'll give you an example. My daughter's casein and lactose intolerant, and she just really battles with dairy. We've tried so many things. And so she's having coconut yogurt. She's not getting that much dairy in. And so I see a lot of children these days that are dairy intolerant, and that could cause a problem with a calcium deficiency. So give us your overall view in terms of how our adolescents and our children can get enough calcium in for their bone development.
Yeah, so if you look at kids and you've got one of your own, so if you remember when they're young, they grow at quite a steady rate. And then when they get into puberty, there's that massive growth spurt. So if you look at calcium needs, it's pretty constant when they're children, and then it really accelerates during that growth spurt. That growth spurt is growth in length, height, as well as then consolidation of the bone. So that part is critical. One of the key things is if someone is dairy intolerant, then we need to look at what alternatives there are. So, for example, fish with bones. So when they have their canned salmon, they need to eat the bone, not just the fish. Same with sardines, you need to eat the whole thing because the calcium is actually in the bone. So a lot of people will go, oh, that's gross. But if they're going to get the benefit of the calcium, it's actually in the bone of the fish. There are alternatives. One thing is people really need to be careful that when they're looking at an alternative beverage, so for example, you mentioned your daughter has coconut yogurt, you've really got to read the label because it may not have the same amount of protein as a regular yogurt and it may not have calcium in it because coconuts don't have calcium. So unless it's been added, it's not like for like. So that's some of the things we really need to be careful with when people are moving away from dairy, milk, yogurt, cheese, and are moving into these alternative products that they are like for like.
Okay, great. But so someone's got children, they're listening now, and they say, okay, how much dairy should my 8-year-old, my 10-year-old, my 12-year-old take on a daily basis using real food? Obviously, we'll talk about supplementation, but real food, milk, yogurt, and cheese, how much should they be having on a daily basis?
Yeah, so during childhood, it's around 3 servings per day. So that would be the easiest would be a glass of milk, a tub of yogurt, and for I'm using Australian
Yeah,
servings, 40 grams of cheese. When they go into adolescence, so that growth spurt, that goes up to 4 a day.
sure. Wow.
Because you imagine they're normally when children are growing, they accrue about 100 grams of bone mineral each year. But when they get into puberty, at peak, boys can be as high as nearly 400 grams per year. So if you're going to be growing that much, we need to have the calcium as an example of a nutrient. We need to make sure. So if they're eating, dairy food or dairy equivalents, they're getting all the other nutrients like the protein. We're getting all these other nutrients that go with it because it's not just the calcium, it's all these other nutrients. Vitamin
Mm,
D, if people are not outside, then vitamin D is low, and we need that to absorb the calcium.
mm. So, what other foods can they get it in? Seeds, nuts, fruit, vegetables? Where else could they get their calcium intake?
Yeah,
Especially because a
so
lot of people are following the paleo diet, so they're having limited dairy. What other
yeah,
foods?
so obviously dairy is the richest source. We know that. When we look at alternatives, for example, there is calcium, for example, in broccoli, but it's not as bioavailable. So it's attached to an oxalate, so it's not as easy to get. So we don't absorb as much. We might only absorb when we oxalate or attach the calcium to these compounds, we only might absorb 10%. So while on paper there's a lot there, we're not absorbing it.
Mm,
If they're using a dairy equivalent beverage, they have to read the label, make sure it's got calcium
mm,
added to it, because most of them don't have natural calcium in it. As I mentioned, the fish with bones, seeds, yep, and nuts. But with young children, small children, they often can't eat enough food. And so you'd have to eat. This is an example. If I took an older person or a younger person and I had a glass of milk, they'd have to have like 7 servings of vegetables, so 7 cups of vegetables
wow.
to get the same amount of protein. Same amount of calcium. And that's almost impossible for a young person, a younger child, or an older person to eat.
So, do you think in modern day cities and just the developed world, there's a calcium deficiency happening out there?
Look, on the whole, what thing with calcium is during adolescence, we actually absorb more of it. That's part of our biology. But what we may see is just low grade low intakes. We haven't got frank deficiency because that comes out, is quite sort of pronounced. We've got this low grade inadequacy, I'm going to call it. So what may be happening is children aren't reaching their peak. So the biggest bone mass they could possibly have based on their genetics. So they're starting adulthood slightly smaller bone than they should. And then if they continue with, bad eating habits, unhealthy eating, then they're not going to maintain the bone as well. And then in old age, they lose bone. So by then, ideally, people maintain enough bone and lose it at a small rate that, they're 120 before their bone is osteoporotic. Doesn't matter because they've passed
Mm.
away. But what we're seeing is that, people in their, especially women after menopause and men, we know around sort of 70, the fracture rates are exponential. So what we may see is that historically, heart attacks would kill a person and cancer was fatal, whereas now we're we're curing cancer and prognosis is good. We're treating heart attacks. We're doing bypass surgery. So what we're seeing is more older people, and we're seeing more of these other diseases such as bone osteoporosis, as well as things like dementia. So we're saving them in their younger old age. They're getting into old age. And as I said, if their bones aren't equipped early on when they were growing, the outcome is bone fragility, more likely to fracture. And if their muscles aren't good and they're losing muscle, then they're more likely to fall and more likely to fracture.
Okay. Is there any comparative research on the T scores? And maybe you just want to define what a T score is from a bone density assessment perspective. Are those T scores changing compared to 40 years ago? Because obviously, I think in sort of modern day cities, the calcium intake's not there, the vitamin D intake's not there. I mean, I've got 100% of people that sit in my clinic and my practice that are vitamin D deficient. And really chatting to so many people over the last 4 years and lectured all over the world, that are 60 NGs per ml, 50 NGs per ml. There are two camps about, the levels of vitamin D, but I've seen levels of vitamin D absolutely plummet, especially in the African population. But what would you say about those T scores? Are they changing? And maybe just define them for the audience.
Yeah, so a T score is the number of standard deviations, so how much you deviate from a healthy person. So, and they match it to a healthy adult population. So if your T-score is -1, it means that your bone density is 1 standard deviation below the norm. So between -1 and -2.5, that's what we call low bone mass or osteopenia. And if they're 2.5 standard deviations, so that's almost, if you imagine a bell-shaped curve, that's the bottom 5% of that curve right down here, that's osteoporosis. So there's two things to it. One is a lot of the machines that use normative data were based on American data. So countries are starting to develop their own normative data. So that's something that's really important. So, for example, if we were to use Caucasian data on an Asian population, their bone density would be so low because they're smaller. So I think what we do now is make sure that we're moving towards normative data that's suitable for the group that we're actually comparing to. The other thing is that we're bigger. So more obesity, we're bigger people. So what you might find is based on how we calculate bone mineral density, plus they're bigger people, their bone density would perhaps be higher than if we compared people in the 1940s and 50s and 60s when obesity wasn't quite as pronounced.
So that normative that you're comparing on that T-score, is that normative level changed? Because you obviously got standard deviations of that normative level. So what you're saying is obesity will increase bone density. We never used to have so much bone density. So in fact, it could be still a good rating system or standard that you're comparing to.
Look, it's what we've got. And until we decide, so there's been a lot of work looking at porosity as a measure. There's other work that looks at, so if you imagine with a bone, you've got holes in it, and it's how those holes are, whether they're all the same size or all different sizes, how the bone is actually formed. They call it heterogeneity versus homogeneous bone. So they're starting to look at other measures because bone density, if you imagine a bone, it's that, okay? It's a cylinder and it's three-dimensional, but bone density is a two-dimensional measure of a three-dimensional structure. So if the structure's big, the bone density is automatically higher. If the structure's small, bone density is automatically lower. So a person may have just a small bone structure, their bone density is going to be low, but for them, they may have adequate bone structure and all the other features that reduce their risk of fracturing.
Okay. Now, parents are listening and they're saying, okay, my kid doesn't eat dairy. I'm really concerned that they're calcium deficient. They might be vitamin D deficient. How would supplementation work with children?
Look, I think the key thing is if they're that deficient or they perceive that they're that deficient, then they really should look at medical attention in terms of having vitamin D prescribed. So if necessary, it's sad that children aren't outdoors playing and getting their vitamin D. Your very point. So as our skin tone gets darker, the amount of time we need in the sun gets longer. So if you have, for example, if I had a really fair-skinned person that lived in South Africa, they just need in summer a couple of minutes because they're fair skinned, they can produce a lot. If I've got a really dark-skinned person, they're going to need a lot more time. So sometimes it's simply that they're not out there enough. Ideally they are, but also I'm not sure in South Africa, but in Australia, we have really big concerns with skin cancer. So we've got this kind of two-part story. We want to protect our skin because skin cancer rates are really high, but we need to have at least a bit of sunlight exposure so that we're producing vitamin D. Vitamin D production is really complex. So here you go. So we've got skin color. So we know the darker the skin, the longer they need. We've got season. So in winter, the sun's further away. I need more time than in summer. Pollution stops the UV coming through. Cloud cover stops the UV coming through. Time of day. So in the early morning, late evening, if you think about the sun, it's on an angle. It's got to go through more layers to reach us. So the UV is not as high. So there's all these features and factors. So it's really hard to go, look, this is how much you need. Because if I said, right, everyone has to have 15 minutes. So the fair-skinned person I've burnt, the dark-skinned people don't even have enough.
Yeah.
So it's a really tricky kind of health message to actually sort of say, what do we need? I'll give you an example. If in Australia, if in summer, if I'm at the very top of Australia, I need 2 minutes. If I'm that same person down in Tasmania, which is our lowest island, I need about 30 minutes.
Okay. Is that per day
How
that
do you,
you're saying, Dr. Sandra?
it's 30 minutes of exposure per day. So
Okay.
that's a lot. So a dark skinned person that low may need 2 hours. Is that feasible for that person to be out in the sun for 2 hours?
And exposed
People,
different parts of the body and making sure that you're not putting SPF factors that block the vitamin D absorption.
yeah,
That's another.
yeah,
And you've got to ensure that you don't burn. So there's multiple factors there with regards
yeah,
to vitamin D.
yeah. Very, very tricky. I often, for my own daughter, I say go out for a few minutes, come back in, then put your sunblock on.
Yeah.
So that she's getting a little bit of sun exposure. And again, you're correct. If I've got all of my body exposed, so I've got, 90%, I'm in a bikini, I don't need as much time as if I've just got my arms exposed.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing on average
So,
in corporate South Africa, those that got a darker skin, African skin, they're without supplementation, they're sitting at about 18 NGs per ml, which is extremely deficient. I mean, osteoporotic literature from 2017 is you need to be greater than 30. And now there's a lot more literature saying for immunity since COVID, looking at 50, 60. There's even groups saying, 70. So it's fascinating. If you're sitting at 18, the multiple factors, not only on bone health, on immunity health, is crucially important. And people are not getting outside enough because they're fearing the sun, but it's not the sun itself, it's the dose that's the most important.
yeah, yeah. And as I said, that's that tricky one. If it's a high UV day, then you can't have as much time out because you'll probably burn before you get what you need. So
Yeah.
it's a very, very, very tricky. The other thing as well is if you look at vitamin D levels, we know at around 30 nanomoles and less, we start to see bone changes. We start to see that parathyroid hormone goes up, which means I'm taking the calcium from the bone. But that relationship isn't the same. So in some countries, people will be at 30, but their parathyroid hormones at normal levels. So it's a very tricky one. And the beauty of when we produce it ourselves is that when we've got enough, we just switch off production. And so we can self-regulate in
Yeah.
that way. When we're consuming it, we've lost that regulation, that switch off mechanism.
Mm.
All animals produce vitamin D. Look at your cats and your dogs and your horses and your cows are all out in the sun. They're doing it as well.
Mm. So is that a good indicator looking at parathyroid if you're concerned about someone and their calcium levels? Because the question is you can measure calcium in the blood, but it has to be kept so consistent. It's such an important mineral that the body will take it out of the bones if there's not enough calcium. So then what you implying now from a functional medicine perspective is to do a parathyroid test to ensure that that's not increasing, because then most likely what's happening is the body's taking the calcium out of the bone.
Yeah, so a bit of both. So you're right. But that's an expensive test and it's not something you'd probably do routinely with people. The other tests as well, which again, not routine, but are the bone markers. So if parathyroid hormone's quite high, yes, it's indicating we're taking calcium from the bone. That taking the calcium from the bone is associated with higher remodeling, which means the I suppose the bone marker that indicates how much we're taking out, like how many holes are we digging in this bone to get the calcium out, goes up. So there are measures, and you're 100% right with serum calcium, it's really tightly regulated. So if that's low, things are pretty catastrophic at that point.
Yeah.
And usually
Okay.
there's a medical reason why it would be so low.
Okay, let's look at protein because let's finish the children, adolescents. In terms of protein, I don't think the population in general is getting in enough protein. But what are your recommendations on protein intake for children and adolescents?
Look, it depends, and there's these two situations. In developed countries, generally they eat that much food, which is why there's obesity, that they're getting enough protein, as long as there's good food in there. When you go back, often, for example, in parts of Africa, there is protein deficiency. And often that occurs when, for example, you've got a young child that's weaned off the mother's milk and then goes on to the normal dietary patterns of the family. And if it's really high in vegetable, so grains and vegetable, they can't eat enough food to get the protein. And then you get your protein malnutrition.
Mm.
So it can happen. Generally, as I said, in developed countries, they're getting more than enough. But we're seeing a shift away from quality food. We're seeing a shift into highly processed food, lots of discretionary food, high in salt, high in sugar, very palatable, but are devoid of good protein.
Mm.
And there's a great professor called Steve Simpson, if you've heard of him, and
Mm.
he does a lot of work looking at what they call protein leverage. So if you imagine, he did it with animals, and animals will naturally eat the protein they need, and it's in a range. So for us, it's between 10% and 30% of our energy from protein. That's what we'll sit at. So if we're eating a diet that's high in discretionary food and high in salt and sugar and all those foods that we're not getting enough protein, in order to meet our protein needs, we have to overeat. And his theory is that's what's leading to obesity because the trigger that we need protein isn't being, I suppose, listened to because there's so much carbohydrate and fat in the diet. So it's a really interesting. He did it with animals, and I'll give you an example. He did it with locusts. And what he did is the locusts come through and they had petri dishes, and one petri dish would have all protein in it, one would have all carbohydrate, and one would have a bit of both. And as the locusts come through, they would naturally look at the one with carbohydrate. They sample it with their feet and go, oh, that's not enough. And they'd go to either the protein or the protein carbohydrate. So they're going to what they needed.
Yeah, I
And
got
what's
you.
happening is we're not doing that now.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I found that, my diet's 50% protein at least. And a lot of the adults that come to my practice and the clinic is if I get their protein intake up, their cravings for refined carbohydrates and ultra processed foods go down. So good quality fats from nuts and seeds and avocados and that, plus protein, then they have less cravings. Their insulin regulates far better. So I found that, and I haven't done a lot of children here, but I find that also if I increase the protein of my own children, they tend to eat less ultra processed foods. Do you see that with your clients or your patients?
Look, I most of my work is with older adults, and now
Mm.
we've got a whole different issue because their protein needs are higher. But back to that leverage concept that if their protein needs aren't met, there's going to be a hormonal response that says, keep eating until you can meet your need. And so if you're providing sufficient protein, and as I said, they found it's between 10 and 30%, that if they're provided a diet that contains that level of protein, that, as you said before, they're not having to overeat all these
Mm.
high, ultra processed discretionary food. I always, with the term ultra processed, it's really the discretionary foods, the high sugar, high salt, high fat, because some good foods are ultra processed. So
Mm.
if you think of flavored yogurt, that's ultra processed, but I'd much rather a person have flavored yogurt than having a soft drink.
Yeah, got you.
So it's the discretionary foods, high sugar, not many nutrients, high fat, high salt.
Mm. Okay, let's move on to adults and sort of your side, elderly patients in terms of protein and calcium. And the study that you did that was incredible, the old age homes just increasing dairy. I've just found in clinical practice that the elderly are not getting enough protein. I think mainly because they can't process it as well. I don't know if the GI tract is just more sensitive. I've got a lot more sensitive as I got older. But let's look at what you found with regards to the studies that you did, and then let's look at some causal factors generally across the board. And I know that at old age homes, there were some variables and factors why they didn't get enough dairy or protein in there, or vitamin D, or because dairy is very, very special. But let's look at your research and then some causal factors.
Yeah, so what we've observed in aged care homes is their protein intake isn't enough. It's about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. And we know with older adults, they need more protein in order to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So how well they can put that protein into a muscle. And I equate it to, I want the amino acids, the things that make up the protein, to go into the cell. And when we're younger, we just tap at the door and opens it up and in they all flood. With older people, we have to knock at the door harder to get the same response for the door to open. So they need more protein to get the same effect as a younger person. So their needs are higher, but they don't eat as much because they're old, their appetite's lower, they're not moving and that. So what we did is we took a group of older adults that lived in care that we knew were low in protein, so about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. We knew from the data they were only getting about one serving of dairy, so milk, yogurt, and cheese, but also about one serving of foods from the meat food groups. That's meat, fish, eggs, legumes, poultry. And so they're deficient. They're insufficient more than deficient. And so if we just simply provided the additional dairy food, because one, they recognise dairy food, milk, yogurt, cheese, and two, it's high in good quality protein, and it also had the other nutrients needed. So we basically fed residents in 30 aged care homes for 2 years with additional dairy food. So we got them up to 3.5 servings a day, and the other residents just went about their normal menu. And by doing that, we reduced fractures by 33%,
Sure.
the hip fractures by 46%, and we found all but one fracture came from a fall, and falls were reduced by 11%. And then we had a subgroup of older adults and we did bone density on them. We did bone structure using high resolution PQCT. We took blood samples. We did all of this. And what we found in these older adults is bone loss was not detectable compared to bone loss occurring about 2% a year in the residents that ate the normal food. The ones that had the more dairy food maintained the muscle in their arms and legs, but those that in their normal eating or the regular food were losing muscle in their arms and legs. They lost weight, they declined their nutritional status. So we were able to maintain their bone, their muscle, and we also had serum that was showing that their bone turnover marker was stabilized, where it kept going up in the control group. We saw IGF-1, which is a hormone that's associated with sort of an anabolic effect, that went up. So we saw all these fantastic changes just using food. That was the beauty of it.
Wow, that's incredible. And that wasn't changing their exercise routines, and that wasn't changing any of movement with them, just the intake.
Yep. Because the intake was low, we were able to get it up to adequate, and we got to 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. So it just shows that if we provide enough protein, they can maintain muscle, and also the other nutrients that were coming from the dairy, such as the calcium. We got them up to the estimated average requirement. And the beauty of this, and this is probably why, one, they're deficient or insufficient to start with. The other is that intake was maintained for 2 years. So the only benefit we get with anything we do, whether it be adequate protein or adequate calcium, is we've got to keep consuming it. It'd be wonderful if I could, eat for a week and then that's it. I never have to eat that food again, but you've got to keep it. So it's got to become part of their normal routine eating. So it's changing eating habits back to less processed, less refined, normal food, go back to food, moving away from these highly refined foods and the ultra processed foods, high in fat, salt, sugar, fun to eat,
Mm,
but not giving us the nutrients we need to maintain health.
mm. I like to, not everyone, but over the years, keep patients at 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I know that's a little bit higher than the 1.1 that you spoke of. But let's talk about what someone, and that's net protein. So let's talk about foods like one egg. How much net protein does that give? A portion of 50 or maybe 300-gram fillet or rump or 200 grams. I think
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
really, really important because people think, oh, geez, I've had like 3 eggs this morning, and, I had a small little bit of salmon, like 60 grams when I went out, and then I'm having some lentils tonight. So I'm getting enough protein intake. So, based on 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, how could someone sort of structure that from a portion size on a daily basis?
Yeah, so almost what you said would almost get you there. So if they had, for example, you said 3 eggs, that would be, depending on the size of the egg, between 6 and 9 grams per egg. So if we aimed for 20 grams per meal, the fillet would probably have, between 10 and 15. That fish fillet, the lentils. So with the lentils, the best thing to do is combine lentils with grain because now we've got a complete protein. So you can do it. We've actually done it with older adults, but the
Mm,
key thing is that it has to be. So if they're having a fillet, it's a good piece of fillet. So if they're having fish, it's a nice lean piece of fish rather than when we have the fish in the batter, depending on where it's produced. Sometimes we found, as an example, that you needed, so the typical pieces in the batter, we need
mm,
2.5 of those to get 1 serving of fish.
sure.
So it's about going good quality rather than bulk quantity. Older
Mm,
people can't eat that bulk quantity. So eggs for breakfast, as you said, fish for lunch, and even if it is, and then having some kind of good protein. So if it is lentils with the grain, having some milk in there somewhere. If it's a milk equivalent, again, if it's a soya milk, that's the closest you'll get to in terms of protein quality. But we've got to be careful because a lot of the alternative milks have no protein in them.
mm. So you're
So
saying
you
an
might,
egg's got like 8 grams. So if someone has 3 grams, that's 24 grams. Okay. But then I get it. So the salmon I'm having is, say, 60 grams of salmon, but how much protein am I getting in the 60 grams of salmon?
yeah, usually it's about the serving is a little bit more. So it'd be about 100 grams as a serving. They'll
Mm.
be getting between, say, 15, 20.
Okay. So
And same with
15 plus 8 plus 24, I'm only at 49 or 39 grams.
yeah.
Okay. And then evening I get a 200-gram fillet. How much am I getting from that?
Oh, yeah, 200-gram fillet, that's a lot. You'd be there with your 200 grams. That would be
Okay.
almost, 40 grams of protein. But we've also got to think about that's a big fillet. That's hard for people. Someone that's healthy and young, they could eat that. I always go back to an older person. They could eat a small fillet. So if they're going to have the meat, make it a small fillet. A serving is about around 65 grams for meat that's cooked. Okay, so it's 100 grams. If they go to the supermarket or the butcher, you get your 100 grams steak. That's a serving once they've cooked it.
So how much is the
And
100-gram
so
steak going to give you in protein, net protein?
what we get in there? You'd probably have around 20
Okay.
or more. So
But if you look at me, 200 grams of fillet, that gives me, say, 40 grams of net protein plus my 39. I'm only sitting at 79. I'm 75 kilograms. So now I'm protein deficient.
well, it's 1 gram per kilogram body weight. You're not
Yeah.
deficient. Deficiency would be down at zero point 0.7, zero point 0.6.
Okay. So I'm
So you're
insufficient then on
adequate.
a 1.5 gram per kilogram then.
When you look at protein, what they do is they look at protein balance. So they look at nitrogen balance and what you need to maintain balance. So if you look at older adults, they're suggesting up to that 1.5. They're suggesting 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight. An average healthy person, we don't have inflammation, we don't have chronic diseases. We only need about 1. So extra isn't necessarily better.
Okay, so but
Whereas,
maybe let me push back on you because like
yeah,
93%
yeah,
of Americans are got a chronic disease by 5 sort of basic metrics. Only 7% of Americans are healthy. Only 15% of South Africans are considered healthy. We have chronic disease at another level. Inflammatory markers are the highest that I've ever seen from a clinical functional medicine
Yeah.
perspective. I just don't know who people in the corporate space and having lectured all over the world, I'm thinking like 10% of people are healthy. And if you take waist to hip ratio, which is, I think, fundamentally important, or looking at a DEXA scan and looking at visceral body fats, I mean,
Yeah.
who's healthy out there? The amount of inflammation that has been caused by all this extra adipose tissue is causing so
Yeah.
many issues. Never mind gut inflammation because of all the processed foods, the toxicity. So that's why I'm sort of saying to my patients across the board, aim for the 1.5, because it's going to help you, especially as you get older.
Yeah. And a lot of it is going back to that point. If they're consuming, between 1 and 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight, if they're to maintain a healthy weight, it means they're eating whole foods and nutritious foods. So really your mechanism is ideally moving them away from the highly processed discretionary food. So if someone followed the dietary guidelines, because they're there for a reason, and if you followed the dietary guidelines as they are, then you would get nutritional adequacy.
Mm.
Everyone will go to a party one day. That's okay.
Sure.
It's okay to have a party, and Christmas is coming. We're all going to overeat. We're going to eat lots of pudding.
Mm.
That's okay. But coming back to your base eating and maintaining, eating more closer to the dietary guidelines,
Mm.
whole grains, lean cuts of meat, dairy. And we know from our work that it didn't matter because low fat dairy and regular fat, it's only 3%, 3.5% in terms of milk. I wouldn't call that a high fat um,
Mm.
meal or drink. It's not actually that high in fat. And we found that we had no effect on serum cholesterol levels with this intervention. And we used majority, like pretty much 99% of it was regular fat.
Mm.
I'd be more concerned about the chips and the burger
Yeah.
and the fat content of that,
Yeah.
because what we're seeing is high saturated fat, high trans fat because of processing, whereas the dairy fats and fats in avocado and fats in nuts and seeds, they're healthy fats
Mm.
and are less likely to cause those big changes to serum cholesterol.
But Dr. Sandra, being in the research space, would you see any problems with, and this is a generalization, of recommending 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight for your average adult, even for someone in your 20s, because of the multiple effects on, limiting the amount of processed food someone's going to be eating, ensuring they're getting enough protein overall? Because even looking at myself, if I'm at 1.5, 152, so I'm looking at like 110 grams per day of net protein. That's a lot of protein, but
Oh, that's
then
a lot.
but that's going to have a significant effect on my diet, ensuring that I get enough protein over time. And that's where I'm sort of recommending it for my patients.
Yeah, but from food. So what people will interpret that as, great, I'll get a protein supplement and I'll supplement my food with this protein
Mm.
supplement. When we consume protein, we only have a capacity to process, so absorb, do all that a certain amount. So if I'm consuming a meal, and just say, for example, I consume a meal and there's 50 grams of protein in that meal, I probably can't process the whole thing. So that excess protein is then going to have the amine taken off it. And now I've got the length, and the choices are I can either use that as an energy source or I convert it to dietary fat. So more isn't always better. It's about adequacy. And we know from the data, it's about 20 to 30 grams per meal.
Okay.
So, in a sense for yourself, if that's your case, it's like 30 grams breakfast, 30 grams lunch, 30 grams dinner. That would be about what you need. Having more may not necessarily be processed. And as I said, excess of anything converted to energy, if it's the certain amino acid, or converted to body fat, which one we don't want.
Mm. Do you have any experience on dried blood spot analysis with regards to amino acids? We do an amino acid test here. We've seen isoleucine, leucine, and valine dramatically decrease over the years, which concerns me, especially with adults. Do you have any perspective that people are not getting diversity in their protein? People are eating the same protein, and that's causing significant problems. For example, this whole collagen drive now of proline, hydroxyproline, and glycine, and we're seeing these numbers increase dramatically. And I'm concerned that people are taking, these collagen supplements every single day. They themselves are processed. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, look, I haven't looked at the dry blood spotting, so I can't comment on that at all. But what we're after is quality protein. So there's two aspects to protein. One is the completeness. So animal sources have complete protein, and also the availability of it. So when you say diversity, the diversity in our diet also gives us the other nutrients. I don't think our body's going to sort of go, oh, that's always from meat, therefore, I'm going to adjust to it. It's just protein, and it's just the right proportion of protein and amino acids it needs. But if I just ate meat, I'm going to not get omega-3s from fish. I'm not going to get other things from legumes. I'm not going to get, calcium from dairy. So just eating the one food, the body's not going to go, oh, gee, that's meat protein. That's, I need to change. But it's more the other nutrients that you're going to miss out on from the other foods. So diversity is good because we're getting all the other nutrients. It's a package. I think we forget food's a package, and all those other nutrients are as important as the protein. Our body really doesn't care that much if it's from an egg or from a piece of meat. It's complete, it's fine, but it's the nutrients those foods give us that's important.
Okay, coming to the end of the show, let's talk a little bit about muscle health. What is your experience with the older generation and sarcopenia and the loss of muscle strength and size, and how important is that for health span and, longevity?
Yeah, what we're after is function. So what we know with older adults is, especially those in aged care, they don't want to live longer, they want to live better. And the ideal for older adults is that they maintain function and independence so that they can keep living better. Sarcopenia, it's an age-related loss, but also it's a lot to do with lack of movement as well. So the more sedentary we become, the more imbalanced our food becomes. We get less muscle, but also you've got less quality in the muscle. So there's fat infiltration in that muscle. Then there's inflammation, and then that's that horrible cascade. So really it's about movement. We know from the data, resistance activity. So when people do activity against resistance, whether it be weights, etc., people can use their body weight as resistance, that maintains the muscle. With muscle, I can't make a muscle bigger with just protein. I have to stimulate that muscle, and that's with movement. Not necessarily going to the gym. We don't have to always go to the gym. It's about keeping active, keeping moving. And a lot of it is about function so that they can carry their groceries, they can put things away in a cupboard, they can lift things. It's that movement that keeps the muscle functioning, that keeps the person ideally at home longer. Because
Brilliant.
that's really what they want. They want to stay home. They don't want to go to care. They want to stay home, and they want to maintain good function.
Excellent. I don't know if you've got a message of hope with regards to bone health and nutrition. There just seems to be so much despair and discouragement out there. How do you see it going in the foreseeable future? Because I just see chronic disease increasing, well, not exponentially right now, because I think it's had its exponential growth, but it really is just growing and growing. And I see bone issue problems and bone mineral density issues for the younger generation more and more. What's your message of hope out there to people listening?
Look, I think the two aspects is a healthy lifestyle. The two aspects is good food, nutritious food, whole foods, and also movement, keeping people moving. Back to what I said before, it's okay to have a hamburger on occasion, or when you go to a party, you're going to have, but it's eating those foods all the time, which is what people are doing. They're not realizing that doing that all the time is going to have a long-term effect on their health. Everyone's going to get old. And so really it's about maintaining a healthy lifestyle, stay moving, keep moving. It's movement that causes a lot of our issues in terms of muscle health, bone health, joint health. So keep moving and go back to basics with the food. Look at those extraneous, high salt, high sugar, high fat foods as a treat. It's not saying you don't ever have it, but look at them as a treat and don't make them your norm. Stay healthy
Brilliant.
for as long as you can.
Dr. Sandra Iuliano, thank you so much. We'll put the links into the show notes. You're doing incredible work at the University of Melbourne. We'll put your research papers as well. Well done to you. I think you're changing generations, especially the elderly. And I think that's important with a simple, effective, and affordable intervention. So I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yep. You're welcome.